Well, hello and welcome back. We are continuing looking at working our way through SQL tutorials and examples. And today we are going to continue looking at stored procedures, but we're going to look at something that is not stored procedures particularly, but just I think used rather often, or at least I know I have. And that is the idea of temporary tables. Now, a temporary table, as we can see here, the command is very much like creating tables in generals, as the general kind of things we've done to this point. And it's essentially supports all of the same things. The difference is instead of create table, you put this temporary. And what that does is that says this table is only going to exist for this session. For example, in a stored procedure that you're going to go ahead, run it, throw it out there, create it, just use it while it's there, and then you're done. You don't have to worry about it anymore. This is something that's basically for sort of like a helper kind of table, so I can gather some data. And that's where we usually use it in a stored procedure. So that's what I'm going to focus with today. And I'm going to use a simple example, as always, but I think this will give you something to sort of work on and look for as we move forward and see where this is just one of the tools we're going to have to do some of the complex data manipulation stuff that's out there. So let's go back to, I want to start with the query just to sort of show. And that is this query. Well, let me go ahead and do this. Let me drop that table. My stuff, and I'll show you working around with that table here in just a minute. Now let's take this query, and what I'm going to do is pull data from that address table, and I'm going to pull data from the lookup type. And if you remember, that lookup type gives you a address type, a name for it, and it has an ID. And having this query, if I was going to run this query a bunch, or if I was going to have to do it over maybe a large set of data or something like that, there are definitely performance issues when you start putting a lot of table joins together. And particularly, now this one's very simple, but let's say I had, I don't know, like 10 or 15 different lookup type values sitting in my table and had to join all of those, then doing so, bringing all that in, and then working with it may be something that's not, doesn't make sense performance-wise. It's just a little too slow. Instead, what we can do is we're effectively going to denormalize this data. Instead of having our ID, we're going to have the name. So when we run this query, we're going to see here that we have we're selecting the ID, city, state, zip, the address name. So this would be like maybe a street address or something like that. But now we also have this name, which is the type. So each of these were business addresses. And this doesn't have that lookup type ID. And so this idea of the temp table is, well, what if we wanted to keep this data around for a little bit? We don't necessarily, this isn't like a source table. This is something where it's more or less almost like a reporting type table. We want to take this and we're going to do something with it. And so let's go ahead and get rid of the normalization and then just do stuff with this data already combined out or resolved out. And what we want to do then is we're going to go in and we're going to create something called temp table. And let's see if I can get all of that right. See if I copy paste it correctly. And so what we have here is we've created this new procedure called temp table. And so you can see we don't have our t_my stuff doesn't exist. And what this procedure does is it's going to come in, it creates a table. It's going to insert data into that table, and that data is it's inserting into t_my stuff. And what I'm doing here, I've got that ID, name, city, state, zip, and type name. And I'm just going to take that same query I just showed that gives me this data, and I'm going to throw it into this. And now here, even notice that I'm going to rename it. I'm not going to call it the T1 ID. I'm just going to call it ID. And then because this is a simple store procedure, I'm just going to do select star from this temp table. We could do this with a regular table, but this is something where we're saying, hey, we don't want this thing to sit around. So if I do call, where is that temp table? Then it comes through, does that select star, and I see that this is that query basically that I just showed you. However, now it's with these are the field names in that temp table. And again, if this was for reporting or something like that, that may be the best way for you to go about it, is that you can actually take whatever the names are in the source database and essentially, I guess, hide them or relabel them in a temp table and then kick this output out. Now you can do that with aliases and stuff like that, but just yet another little bit of work or bonus that you can add while you're doing this. Now with this, let's go back and do our show tables. And we're going to see that although I created t.my stuff, it does not exist. It's not there because it was only there. In this case, the scope was only during the execution of the stored procedure. Now, if I go back and do, where was that create? Let me just do it this way. But now if I take the same thing and I do create temporary table, my stuff, if I do it inside just a normal session, oh, it says it already exists. So it's not even showing it in the, it is not showing it everywhere. I wonder if, because it's out there, it didn't get cleaned up, but it also doesn't show, when I do show tables. Yeah, so it doesn't even show it for here because it was owned by, because it's owned by the store procedure. If I do drop table t_my stuff, then, okay, now he's gone. But if I take the same thing and now I'm going to create him, I quit out, let's see if he's still there. So it sometimes changes stuff. So if I do use, what's it? Tutorial, show tables. Let's see if I do select star from t_my stuff. Yeah, it says it doesn't exist. If I try to create it, it's not there because it's a temporary table. And so once I quit out of this session, it's gone. And so with that store procedure, typically your session is going to be opened and then closed and then you're done. Now so it's not the store procedure itself. I misstated that. It's let me jump back in here. It is the session you're in. So if you connect and run a couple of store procedures and then disconnect, the temp table will disappear. But you could have multiple store procedures working on that temp table. But now in this case, I'm not seeing it because I did not set up everything to see it. This is going to show you only your regular tables. But again, it's one of those things you don't really have to keep track of it because once you close the session out, then your data's gone. But of course, that's the challenge, is you don't want to be in a situation where you do a lot of work building out a temp table where you really want to keep that, information. And then as soon as you lose a session, then it's all those queries and everything have to be rerun. But with the temp table, you can even, I'm pretty sure, let's go do this. So let's do create index temp idx on t.my stuff. Let's just do name. Let's do the ID. So now let's go back and see how that works for us. And so when we do it, everything's there. And if we go back and do the call, how far back is that? Okay, that's back a little bit. There it is. Oh, I needed to use tutor. Sorry, use tutorial. There we go. And so it runs through, and so this time it actually created an index in there. So which again show you can create multiple tables. You can do foreign keys. You can create indexes. There's a lot that you can do. And in particular, again, when you're in a stored procedure, these are very useful because you're probably, depending on what you're doing, you may have some subset of data that you're trying to build out, and you're wanting to work with that. You're wanting to manipulate that. And it may not be the same use that that data is in the source database, particularly if you're like let's say you've got a transactional kind of database where you're storing, I don't know, very transactional. Let's say that you have a database that's storing credit card transactions for sales for your company. And you've got all this data in here, and all it's doing typically is inserting new transaction records. And so you don't want to have a lot of indexes on it. You don't want to have a lot of overhead because you want that insert to just go quickly and be done. You don't want to have to worry about stuff reindexing and slowing down, particularly as the table gets large. But if you want to do a bunch of queries on that, then, of course, one thing you can do is just go create a whole nother database, pull that stuff out, put your indexes on, things like that. But you can also do it, I will say, sort of on the fly by creating a temp table and create that table, pull the data over, set up your indexes, and then go work on the data that way. So work on it from that temp table as opposed to your actual table. And there are some other things we're going to see that are similar approaches to doing this kind of stuff. But a temp table is one of those that it's just such an easy way to do that sort of work on a regular basis, particularly within the database. If you're going from a programming language, what you would probably do is you would do a query, you pull the result set back into your language, into your application, and then on that side, on that application side, you're going to walk through it. You're going to do your manipulations or calculations or whatever it is that you need to do. Well, what this gives you is an easy way to build out, a result set that you can work with. And now we're going to look at some other things we can do as we get further into our stored procedures. But this one, I really just wanted to make sure that I covered temp tables and talked about those for a bit, because I do think they're going to be, useful for us moving forward. And it's just one of those that I figured also would be a pretty good, like one day topic kind of thing. So, bottom line, don't be afraid to play around with commands we've already learned, we've already looked at, and even some of the others within your stored procedures. You can do a lot of stuff. Now, like I said, I could create a whole table here. It becomes complicated if you're going to start doing dynamic SQL and things like that. But I could have stored procedures that take parameters, and based on those, they go out and build tables, and they go out and do data loads and all kinds of stuff. Particularly if you wanted to somehow have a way to generate multiple, in MySQL, databases that are, like make one per customer, stuff like that. If you want to do some sort of vertical, siloing and stuff like that, so that you have one database that you hit and that's where you get your data. You don't have to worry about data crossing over from one, that's one group can access that can also where it would be accessed by somebody else as well. But that's getting into a lot of, I guess, some of the more advanced kinds of things that we're going to talk about later, most likely, if not in this session or this series, then in some of the others, because that does get a little bit more into security over just being in a database. That being said, I digress a bit. So I just wanted to point this out. Temporary tables, remember, they last for the session. So if you do some stuff and you're like on that command line, if you're sitting here on a command line and you create a temporary table and you quit and come back, it ain't going to be there. And you're going to have to rebuild it, which again goes back to the whole idea of, let's store this stuff out, start a file somewhere and execute that file. Or, maybe it's a stored procedure, so you can execute that all within that stored procedure, and then all is good. That being said, it's time to wrap it up for today. Keep this, I guess, short-ish and give you a little bit of time back. As always, go out there and have yourself a great day, a great week, and we will talk to you next time.